Thank you so much, Kanita, for the invitation. I'm happy to be part of this panel and here, and know that it is a great challenge to work on a collection, African collection. I would like also to thank all staff of the Queen's University and all people who make this possible. Thank you for the organization of this institute. My talk is about what Giving Earth brings us together here around two experiences, directly experiencing and relating to the absence of certain objects in Benin. Their presence in Western collection and the difficulty that this creates for the constitution of knowledge. The first is Gelede. What is Gelede? In order to not dwell on it, it is necessary to know that it is a cultural fact, characteristic of the world view of the Yoruba societies spread out today in Nigeria, Benin, and Togo. To this day, for example, the question of its origin remains unresolved between those who believe that it is located in the former kingdom of Ketu in Benin, and those who, like Akpona, on the basis of various oral sources, believe that the origin of Gelede will be in Ilobi, a hamlet located in the present-day Federal Republic of Nigeria. The main reasons: the important successive migration characteristic of this ethnic group, which gradually has swamped large area in the West African sub-region. The current general characteristic of Yoruba's culture date back to a very long time before the Christian era, to the emergence of the Nok culture, as pointed out by Fag in 1963, Willett in 1971, and Drewal in 1990. These are the characteristics which transmit from generation to generation, and having undergone many mutations, brought on the one hand the various contributions of the people encountered, and on the other hand the evolution of the material used that have taken shape and result in what we know today. Here I present some Gelede masks, but all of these masks are not more in Benin, but in Musée of Quai Branly to Paris. That's why I talk about. Despite the patriarchal system that governs these people, the main function of the Gelede is to celebrate our mothers and ask for their indulgence in solving the problem of society. Therefore, all manifestations of the Gelede are ad hoc. That means linked to a specific problem the society experienced. Often very difficult that the society is experiencing at the time the decision was made to dance the Gelede. The choice of the superstructure that we trivially call mask that accompanies the ceremonies is then fundamentally linked to the pending problem. Thus, no mask ever resembles another, and that is why, after this first use, it is pieced throughout the ears or nostril to signify that it should not be used for anything else. This led to the huge misunderstanding that resulted in the destruction of the colonial administrator have created, at the very least, an irreparable zizanic, since most of the masks have left the country. Indeed, each manifestation of the Gelede being ad hoc, the mask that was used on this occasion constitutes the revealing document of the history, the psychological stage, the social progress, philosophic and artistic life of the society concerned. Moreover, the name, the same skill as well as the ability to make the imaginary real depend on each period and each artist. Therefore, each mask that disappears along with all the immaterial aspects that characterize it, notably the songs and dances, is an archive that was burned. It is what underlined Jean Gabus by writing, each object is witness of something, history, techniques, forms, function, and often of several things at the same time, if not of all, and that in various degrees. However, at the same time as these objects were being collected, a reinforced separation between Europeans and non-Europeans was implemented or even staged because of the object on display. The men had to be kept at the distance or be inscribed in a relationship of domination. As a result, museums in the West have invested little in the study of the object, particularly their provenance, but also their inventory. Until 2016, there was no research on the origin of African pieces in many museums. We'll talk about masks later. The second is Boccio. It is, as Joseph Adande referred to in 1996, a sculpture of nothing, always roughly carved and often installed around living culture. These places are privileged for the manifestation of great magic and pantheism because everything is possible there. The Boccios functions is to watch over the horses in this environment. It is also often designed to prevent death from taking hold of someone, in some cases or in others, to fully facilitate it. I will not insist on what the Botio represent in Beninese culture. It will be more edifying to expose here my experience in relation to the production of knowledge on this kind of sculpture. In 2013, while I was in a research program in Berlin for about a year, one of my students wanted to do his master on the following topic, l'art sculptural à Gonly. I say that in French because that was in French. L'art sculptural à Gonly, essai d'analyse stylistique. He wants to try to study Botio sculpture, but from the perspective of style evolution. But the requirements of such studies are merely related to the establishment of the sufficient corpus given a long-term perspective. The unceasing effort of the student, who has been several times in his field of research, which he knows well because he has already carried out the research for the master's degree, have come to nothing. The Agonli country does not count many Botio anymore, which are either destroyed, sold, or taken away. It was therefore recommended to go and see the Ethnographic Museum in Porto Novo. And all these Botio I show here are from Ethnographic Museum of Porto Novo, but they were in museum because they are heavy and long, so they cannot transport them. That remain in Benin because it's difficult to transport them. And it carried out for the destroyed and sold. It was therefore recommended to go and see the Ethnographic Museum in Porto Novo. This did not solve the problem ever, but the important issue that could erase, even if there were a solution at the museum, is a data disruption that could be created in relation to his field of research. The museum, in fact, receives objects from all over Benin and could naturally not have only objects Botio coming only from Agonli, and thus not enough elements to feed the corpus. As a result, the subject was abandoned because to succeed in a studies of style with a chance of arriving at a good analysis over time, it is necessary to count 30 or 50 years of regular production and then of possibility of reconstitution. Since colonialization, sculptural production has changed direction, seeking to satisfy more a target of colonial administrators and tourists than to continue in the same vein. Hence, the introduction of Christianity made disappear both the production and the sculpture because of the demonization of the latter. After independence, I thought there were still a few sculptures, Bouture sculpture declined and the region was almost completely impoverished. To summarize, it must be said that in addition to the absence of the object, due to the massive export during colonization, successive evangelization, but also clandestine sales, there is the difficulty of identifying the evolution of the style of this culture and to succeed to organizing the production of knowledge on the mythical religious environment. These two examples show the complexity of the studies to be undertaken with regard to the collection of the Agnès Etheringold Art Center. Our Zoom of all the members of panel, we have many Zoom meetings. Our Zoom meeting have identified some avenues that need to be pursued. We also need to invent over in relation to the particularity of this collection, which was at first private before finding itself today in a collection in a space open to the public. This mode of collection of this environment being never the same. My experiences of collection in Germany has taught me that. We will come briefly on the Gelleder mask. The problem with this mask Gelleder is that this theme, the sculpture is about knowledge and domination, because you have their snake, and so I'm not sure that this mask has served to ceremonies. We need to continue the research to know exactly when they carve this mask. The second problem is that it raises a great polemic about African sculptures, because in the 40th centuries, people who collected the first African sculpture believed that Africans don't have a notion of colors. So every sculpture in Africa is monochrome. But we have some sculpture from Africa, and I'm not the first who speak about that. Lesinger speaks of that since 1960s. There is a color on the sculpture in Africa. That means people also have notion of colors. We have to discuss about that. This sculpture is, I think, also a bit problematic, because that is for the fast, not for 2 normal days. And if we take into account what is about Gelleder ceremonies is every time to solve a difficult situation in the society. We can also there ask where and who did that. And this is possible use because there is a symbol of Chango. Maybe you have already heard about Chango. It's a divinity. And this, we discussed that with the people of Cape Branly, and it is possible that was used for the, and the last is that this Gelede, mass Gelede, they continue to bring out Gelede, even a contemporary Gelede. That means the field is really impoverished from the Gelede. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Romuald. Now we'll have Carolina's video.
Hi everyone, my name is Carolina Manuel. I am a PhD student at Queen's in art history, and I'm doing a practicum with Dr. Kanita Lila at Agnes this summer. And this is part of my research that I've been developing with her. I'm also supervised by Professor Dr. Juliana Bevilacqua. And the name of this presentation is called Language Reflections in Archival Materials from the Lane Collection of African Art. And I would like to apologize up front for the birds. Language bears witness to the way we see and experience the world and our place within it. For institutions that have colonial legacies, like art museums, the English language is saturated with terms that reinforce domination and hierarchy. This excerpt, contained in the catalogue of With Open Mouths, on display at the Agnes Etherton Art Center from August 2021, was written by Dr. Kanita Lila, Associate Curator of the institution. Within a specific context, such as that of Agnes and its respective Lane collection of African art, it provokes us to think about language, the mediator of all relations, in its use and disuse. Language is capable of bringing together or separating universes in their differences. This is the subject of this brief explanation, how the African works in the Lane collection have been scripted and presented by language since their acquisition as pieces of art by a museum, the Agnes Etherton Art Center. According to Catherine Hale, the Lane collection donated to Agnes in 1984 is the result of 40 years of acquisitions of African pieces by the couple Justin and Elizabeth Lane between 1940 and 1980. Comprising more than 570 objects, the collection has different origins primarily from West African peoples, with objects in different sculptural forms. According to Hale, at the time of the donation, the collection was considered to be the largest Canadian collection of African art in private hands. Also, according to this research, the Langs would have participated in a select group of African art lovers in Canada, a network of connections responsible in large part for the African pieces present in Canadian institutions until today. Using Herbert Guntz and Pierre Boudier, Hale argues that the collection of African objects made by the Langs, as well as their subsequent acquisition by Agnes, participates in a context governed by a culture of taste, largely interested in what she called modernist primitivism. That said, a video, 1986, and a version of its script about the Lane collection, produced when the works were acquired by the Agnes Etherton Art Center, as well as two other exhibition catalogues, Visual Variations from 1987 and Heroic Figures of 1988, both exhibitions by Jacqueline Fry with pieces from the collection, will guide this reflection. My premise is that this archive of materials provides a good basis through which to examine early theoretical underpinnings of the Lane collection. My objective will be to problematize these perspectives. With access to a first script of the video and to the video in question mentioned, entitled respectively The Lane Collection in Cultural Perspective and the Justin and Elizabeth Lane Collection of African Art, it is possible to reflect on the language assumed to present the highlights of this extensive collection. The distinction between the script I had access to and the video itself is necessary and interesting, as the text has been modified to fit in a more compact format. Thus, the access to these two documents reveals an important stage of the curatorial process, the one that builds a discourse on the presentation of the works. In the video The Justin and Elizabeth Lane Collection of African Art, images of art makers and songs with artificially selected rhythmic beats set the stage for the presentation of the collection. The collection is limitedly represented by some examples of objects subjected to categorizations. From now on, let me introduce some problematic excerpts from the script. Excerpt 1. As is the case in Western culture, African sculptures create within the recognizable limitations of their own art traditions. Western culture, or the idea of the West, distinguished from a polarity with the rest, as explained by Stuart Hall in his 1992 essential essay, is often a vague and stereotyped image, just as much as the marginalized cultures that are deemed to be called primitive. However, the idea of the West is related here and will be cited by many authors as an hegemonic and standard-setting place, creating asymmetrical relations with the other. As much as the excerpt, which appears only in the script, strives to argue that recognizable limitations exist not only in the traditions from which African sculptures originate, but also in Western culture, this is almost never said about Western art. This happens because Western culture is based on the idea of civilization, known to be the holder of history and multiple knowledge that does not recognize limits. Hegemonic thinking feeds on these asymmetries, in whose origin all sorts of binarisms can be found, such as the Cartesian distinctions between body and mind, art and craft, form and content, masterpiece and object. When African works are moved to the other side of the polarity, inside museums, the contextualist and formalist approaches to them compete for space. This was especially true in the late 80s. Among the texts in the Catalogue of Heroic Figures of 1988, in an Agnes exhibition, Nigerian philosopher, artist, and curator Nkiru Nzegu discusses these two approaches. She explains that for contextualists, information about the origin and customs that surround the piece are essential for understanding it, while formalists believe that information about the context of a work suffocates the experience of aesthetic appreciation, simply capturing the formal elements. Although this discussion still exists, the inseparability between both is increasingly recognizable. Excerpt 2. Experts can in this way often identify the village from which a carving comes or even the individual artist who produced it. After generally identifying the ways in which artists receive their training on the continent, mentioning apprenticeship systems and a gender distinction that places men as the major object producers, the text presents in this excerpt the figure of the expert, who is capable to identify and categorize productions based on a vast knowledge. Such knowledge can reach, as the text states, even identify the identity of the individual who produced the piece. In the Visual Variations catalog from 1987, the second exhibition featuring pieces from the Lane collection, curator Jacqueline Fry writes a text that, above all, is sensitive and careful in dealing with the works as well as the entire issue of African arts in Western contexts. However, with regards to the authorship of the works or other gaps in knowledge about them, the text adopts a silencing posture. Although Fry consciously positions herself in relation to these issues at the beginning of the text, she seeks to accept the limits of interpretation, avoiding the lack of information about the artist, so that this does not impede the objective of the exhibition to demonstrate all the inventiveness of African sculpture. Fry chooses to speak of visual variations and the possibility, although obvious, that they are a sign of imagination. By adopting the concept of visual variations, Fry avoids potentially slippery points, complicating understandings of style as she draws a distinction between this concept and visual variations. This conscious yet silenced posture avoids the problem of African productions displaced from their context. Excerpt 3. The sculptures may, for this purpose, be seen as falling into 5 basic categories as follows. Spiritual and ceremonial sculpture, devotional objects, divinational and magical objects, power and status objects, and decorated domestic objects. These categories also do appear in the video and reflect the ways in which African works are classified and organized according to Western distinctions. The Western scholar determined not only an organization for the understanding of this vast, heterogeneous production, but also inevitably uses terms such as magical and power, conceptions of Western values that reflect in translation, risking imprecision and ignorance about relevant values within the context of origin. In other books that I had access to in the Agnes Library in African art, such as Art in Africa by Tibor Bodrogi and African Art, Its Background and Traditions by René Wassing, both from 1968, the use of problematic terms is very evident, such as exotic and art of simple people, as well as the affirmation of an opposition between Western art and African art. In the case of Bodrogi's work, there is also an indistinction between African art and prehistorical art. In addition, the ruler of Western values appears in the author's insistence on giving great prominence to modern art in order to speak of African pieces. Even in books such as African Art in American Collections by Robbins and Nutter, published in 1989, and therefore more current than the first exhibitions of the Lane collection, bring retrograde conceptions of Africa. Although we are talking about old books on African art, many of these conceptions are crystallized and outdated in museum archives, as is the case with the information we still have about African works at Agnes. In the registration of which piece, there is the use of inappropriate terms based on Western conceptions. There are things that cannot be arbitrarily translated, because they relate to a very specific African worldview. It is worth remembering that the reflection put forward by Caroline Dean in 2006, when thinking of a supposed translation for the Quechua term Totecatl as being artist. She asks, what has been lost or added or confused in the translation? Excerpt 4. It's noteworthy that division of labor by sex in other crafts varied from region to region. Other example. Music was of equal importance in these ceremonies. The excerpts are written in the past tense. Sally Price's Primitive Art in Civilized Places attempts to temporality issues. She cites William Rubin from 1984, for whom tribal art expresses a collective feeling rather than an individual one. Primitive artists, according to this thought, would be unthinking and undifferentiated beings. Because of that, these peoples would not experience historical changes. Africa and Oceania peoples would not have history or memory. The history of primitive art is written in the present, but it is chosen to portray it in the past tense. From Johann Fabian's Time and the Other, 1983, we learned that the social-cultural nature of certain conceptions of temporality is opposed to the strictly chronological ones. For Fabian, typological time is the most used in discussions of primitive art. It contrasts with physical time. According to Sally Price, Fabian's analysis helps to understand why the so-called primitive art objects produced in the late 1980s to the present moment are systematically excluded from the modern art category. To contrast modern and primitive is to use a temporal metaphor that distances two cultures that are historically contemporary. Excerpt 5. Among the devotional objects, fertility figures are of particular interest. Robert Swain, director of Agnes Center in 1984, at the time of the acquisition of the Lane collection, wrote a foreword in the Catalogue of Visual Variations. This is not an exhibition of masterpieces. According to him, the diversity of types of pieces offer the potential for exploring the visual form. As in the excerpt from the script, Swain's speech indicates that there are selection criteria to determine which works deserve to be highlighted, whether for aesthetic reasons or the supposed authenticity attributed to the piece, for its proven use in a community-specific practices, or for the provenance of collections that give it a pedigree. These criteria exist and belong to Western culture. Sidney Casper, in her famous and controversial text, African Art and Authenticity, A Text with a Shadow, 1992, questions the cloudiness of this judgment. Who decides and how they assure the authenticity of an object? Dr. Kanita Lila, in the Catalogue of With Open Mouths, pays attention to the history of the collections as something more real than the exhibitions tell. De Vol tells the history of objects that are not considered masterpieces, that do not have a pedigree nor claim to be authentic. A story, according to her, of trauma and imprisonment. The collection is a place where the ancestors lie, isolated, wrapped in plastic, stored for extended periods, reinforcing the imperial taxonomies of display in a suspended dream world. This real world, according to the curator, is the world of the unseen. As these case studies have shown, working with language can play a decisive role in transforming the way we look at objects from Africa, bringing the unseen to the world of the seen. The discussion about the use of language and what it can reveal to us about our own conceptions of the world is very interesting and especially relevant for the rethinking collections, recording and curation practices, and in the Agnes Atherton Art Center. In the records of works in the Lane collection, attention is drawn to the imprecise terms in which they are described as well as the many works that lack information. It is necessary, if not to fill in the gaps with information, to discuss these absent and misused terms.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Nomusa Mahupu, who is Associate Professor in Art History and Deputy Dean of Transformation in the Humanities at the University of Cape Town. And she's had many prestigious awards, and so she'll be joining us now. Thank you.
Hi, the joys of being short.
When you kumbela, when you kekuseni, when you kumbela, we babu yandishia, when you kumbela, when you kekuseni, when you kumbela, we babu yandishia.
Good morning. So you can move when the music plays. I trust you're keeping well. It's been a thought-provoking past few days, and I think one that has necessitated that we rethink, reframe, or rethink our frame of mind at least. But I think particularly, especially in thinking about the transformative processes of institutions in different parts of the world, but also particularly institutions on the African continent. Now, South Africa, of course, is particularly different, and I'll talk about why. Before I do that, I wanted to just quickly make a reference to the song that you've just heard. So that was Miriam Makeba and Harry Belafonte in the song When You Go Mbombela. Mbombela that they are referring to is a train, right? It's the trains that in South Africa were constructed to move the labor from the areas that were created for black people, the Bantustans, to the mines and back, right? So it's movement, it's internal migration, but also it's contained migration. But interestingly enough, the word umbombela in isiSwati also means a gathering in a small place. And I wanted to begin with that song because it reminded me of the image from the exhibition with Open Mouths, where you have these gatherings of the sculptures from the Lang collection. But of course, behind that, you have the sound of the ocean. And of course, this enables me to begin to think about the importance and significance of movement, of itinerancy, and how we can begin to think about the impact of particular types of movement, but what movement should mean for how we rethink museums today, especially within the African continent. So I come into this conversation from several entry points. First, in my interest in African art as social practice, I run a platform called the Creative Knowledge Resources, which facilitates dialogues on African art and social engagement. Second, in my interest in transforming institutions, and Kanita, you'd already mentioned that I work as the Deputy Dean of Transformation at the university. Prior to that, I was and still am a member of the Black Academic Caucus at the university, but also chairing the Works of Art Committee, which oversees and manages the university's art collection. So already been, in some ways, caught in these conversations and discussions about what we do with the collections that we have that we have in the institutions. So part of that of these portfolios have been to address the questions that all institutions are facing, and that's the question of imperialist legacies, through which those institutions are built. But we expect that this question would look different from the African continent. For us, of course, it's about, once the return happens, what kinds of institutions do we build? Do we simply just mimic the kinds of museums that have always existed? But what kinds of institutional cultures do we then also generate? South Africa, of course, is different. For many African countries, the call is for the restitution of objects. For South Africa, it's not necessarily that there are objects that must, yes, of course, there may be some in some collections that must be returned to us, but that South Africa itself has to return collections from other African countries. So we stand in the position of colonized and colonizer, which is a quandary. And so for me, this question has always necessitated a need to attend to the spatial politics, especially in South Africa. Whenever one encounters the museums, and I think I'm really grateful to Kanita for having given us the chance and opportunity to really feel and be with the Lang collection. And in my mind, I kept thinking, what happens when we close our eyes, when we no longer have something to see and we hear it? What are the journeys that we might learn from listening? Because you walk into the vault and you're confronted with a very heavy silence. But then also the minute you start to close your eyes, you start to realize that there's a cacophony of sounds. But of course, museums are constructed with this, not just with the idea of this missing silent sound, but also, of course, they are a particular representation of geography. This we all know, right? It's about the compression of time and space, but also often the way that they're displayed are based on a particular kind of, or at least on the basis of geographical taxonomies. So in many cases, when we look at these objects, we may not know who the maker is. We may speculate on the provenance. We may think about the people who collected the objects, but we are almost always certain of the region objects, of the regions to which the objects can be traced. And sometimes we do that, because of stylistic aesthetics and so on. But also, of course, the entry of these objects into personal collections. So with these objects, of course, we are confronted with a kind of resounding of skewed geographies, but also particularly the unfinished and suspended journeys. These objects always mark places that will never exist again. I'm reminded here of the adage that you can never step in the same river twice, because it always changes so rapidly that it's completely a different constituency the second time you step in it. And it makes me feel in some ways that there is this experience that African art collections are these mournful spaces. We're mourning geographies that will never exist again. And we're mourning spaces that we can never recuperate. But there's also something hopeful in that experience, in the possibilities of the pathways that we should be seeking to create. But when one thinks about those journeys, and particularly collecting, collecting in my view is a kind of journaling of the collector's travels. And in many cases, it is about, not just possessing the object, it's about possessing place. So if you think about collectors in those days, it wasn't just that I have this particular sculpture, but look, I have been there. I have been to that place. So for me, then, any meaningful talk of decolonization has to take very seriously the question of space and territory. I am reminded here of the way that Henry Lefebvre put it, and he says, any revolutionary project, whether utopian or realistic, must, if it is to avoid hopeless banality, make the reappropriation of the body in association with the reappropriation of space into a non-negotiable part of its agenda. It makes sense, therefore, to consider a peripatetic approach through which we recall the nomadic, wandering, itinerant lives of objects and the people from whom they were taken. Whatever our curatorial resolve, it would seem to me that to hear these resoundings would necessitate movement of the unsettled, restless, in-transit beings we encounter in the carceral geographies of museums. So this presentation is arranged in the sense of 3 vignettes. They're not necessarily related. They are about different locations. But again, this is an exploratory discussion of the personal experience of some of the collections that we've encountered in South African museums, but again, also the encounter with the Lang collection. So I start with the first one. Okay, so many of you may be familiar with this phrase, witch doctor, Livingstone, I presume. You might have, of course, seen it in multiple movies. I think there is a questioning of whether the statement was actually made, was actually journaled in Henry Morton Stanley's Journeys to the Congo under the instruction of King Leopold. And of course, we know of the kind of violence that journey represented. But I won't necessarily go into that detail. Of course, the music here is to begin to think about particular types of journeys. So let's imagine this. It's 1942. The artist Emma Stern sets out to travel to the Congo. While there, she acquires mats, figurines, masks. Well, of course, during this period, she also travels to Dakar, to Zanzibar. She gets stores, window frames that become part of her paintings, but of course become part of her personal collection. And today, all of these objects that she's collected are now housed in a house that she bought in 1927, in a house that today is referred to as the Firs, and it's in Rondebosch in Cape Town. Of course, this was the question we were faced with. What do we do with the West African works that are sitting in South Africa? Because we now are like Western museums who are sitting with West African collections. But if you start to think about, obviously there's not enough time to do this. If you start to think about the individual journeys of all of those objects, and the way that they trace Irma Stern's own movement. Take, for example, the Luba caryatid stool. Prior to its journey to Rondebosch in South Africa, the stool would have been used during inaugurations of chiefs. But also, one begins to realize that it's also part of a not yet heard social life and journeys. Irma Stern, like many Europeans in the 1930s and 1960s, would have traveled, and perhaps to quote Lanitra Berger, Stern's travels represented a period of South African internationalism that began to decline with apartheid's introduction in 1948. The South African audience was curious and interested in other African cultures, perhaps as a confirmation that white supremacy was an effective way to maintain their high standard of living. It would also reflect what would be a period of accumulation of African objects from other African countries by white South Africans. It cemented a particular kind of ethnic separatism that was also taking shape in South Africa, and particularly the social engineering, the spatial engineering of apartheid, in which people were then separated by race. Similar kind of logic that we see in the way that museums are. But also when we start to zoom out of the museum as a space itself, we begin to realize that the location of museums in South Africa were in spaces that were meant to create particular types of settler publics, of a growing middle-class bourgeoisie, that then, of course, would have these cultural objects, but the idea of being in the world all at the same time. So in many ways, African collections in South Africa have a similar kind of dislocatedness as in European and American museums. And we were faced with this question about access because, of course, when in 2015 the Rhodes Must Fall movement started, the question was, how do we provide access? Because we have these public places that cannot be accessed. What apartheid spatial planning did was to separate people, but also to take them very far from the city centers, but also very far from the museums. So how do you take museums to people? Because obviously the bigger goal is to change that kind of spatial planning. And you need leaders with serious vision for that kind of work. But it didn't actually make sense, So when we realized, oh my goodness, but we're taking these works to their so-called communities, these communities would have no resonance with any of these objects. And I remember someone in the group saying, oh, but maybe we then have to appeal to the migrant communities from West Africa who are in Cape Town. And again, very problematic way of thinking, because even in Cape Town, there isn't a homogeneous migrant community, West African migrant community that one can so easily refer to. One can begin to see, I think something that Kanita, you also mentioned, the particular crucial nature of understanding the way that space works, but also, again, the ironies that are embedded in the translocation of European publics onto African landscapes and what that has meant for the people who were there, who occupied those places before, and perhaps in more nomadic senses than we often make it out to be. There is this bizarre disconnect and estrangement with African art collections that necessitates movement. And if you think about the works in the Irma Stern collection, by remaining captive in the house, in the museum, the more they recede from public life and from the social imaginary. Okay, I'm going to go to the next vignette, and I'll try and wrap up everything because I also realize that I might go a little over time. Second vignette.
There's a train that comes from Namibia and Malawi. There's a train that comes from Zambia and Zimbabwe. There's a train that comes from Angola and Mozambique, from Lesotho, from Botswana, from Swaziland, from all the hinterlands of southern and central Africa. This train carries young and old African men who are conscripted to come and work on contract in the gold and mineral mines of Johannesburg and its surrounding metropoli. 16 hours or more a day for almost no pay. Deep, deep, deep down in the belly of the earth, when they are digging and drilling for that shiny, mighty, evasive stone, or when they dish that mishmash mash food into their iron plates with the iron shovel, or when they sit in their stinky, funky, filthy, flea-ridden barracks and hostels, they think about the loved ones they may never see again because they might already have been forcibly removed from where they last left them, or wantonly murdered in the dead of night by roving and marauding gangs of no particular origin. We are told. They think about their lands and their herds that were taken away from them with the gun and the bomb and the tear gas and the Gatling and the cannon. And when they hear that choo-choo train, a chugging and a pumping and a smoking and a pushing and a pumping, a crying and a steaming and a chicken and a
Okay, that is Hugh Masekela. Okay, very popular now. Revival of Hugh Masekela. But of course, he's referring to, again, the train, which was part of the migrant labor system in South Africa. And you'll remember Cecil John Rhodes, of course, planned to create the railway all the way from Cape to Cairo in order not only to move bodies and labor, but also, of course, to move mineral resources. But of course, Hugh Masekela enables me now to think about a different type of movement, or different types of journeys, not just, of course, of the European settler-collector, but the Africans themselves. But also particularly on the question of labor. Now, the other thing that one encounters whenever one experiences whenever you encounter African art collections is again the silence around labor. Again, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes we may not know the maker, but the question about who labored is also almost always a silent question. But one, of course, that is very crucial and necessary to positioning. Labor sits centrally in the usurping of space and territory and the exercise of power. And in many ways, African art collections almost seem to be displayed in ways that labor is eclipsed. Now, I want to think about the journey of one artist, and again, there are many, but particularly Ernest Mancoba, who in 1938 leaves South Africa to go to France. Part of Ernest Mancoba's work, and of course, he stays there for a long time, starts a family there, becomes part of Cobra. I've sat in conference presentations where there are people who can talk about Cobra and say absolutely nothing about the labor that Ernest Mancoba contributed to Cobra. But a part of a series of works by Ernest Mancoba depict the Kota reliquary figures. Now, of course, a very curious addition, because quota reliquary figures would have never been something that is used in South Africa particularly. So it's a particular kind of frame of reference that comes up in his experience with European modernism. His exploration of quota reliquary figures is also particularly interesting. So not only is he dealing with the representation of the sculptural object, but it also starts to dissipate into marks. It almost starts to become invisible. You yourself as a viewer have to start to make out that shape of the quota reliquary figure. But also you begin to think about what this kind of reference to particular notions of Africanness in relation to West African sculptures might have meant for the formation of modern art, and particularly African artists like Gerard Sekoto. So post-independence and what Chika Okeke-Agulu refers to as post-colonial modernism, something that actually may be better defined as neo-colonial modernism, relied on the idea of these kinds of works and these kinds of collections as reference for formulating what it meant to be modern and African. But remember, there was also a time of complete overhaul of our understanding of geography, because this is when the idea of nations had to be formulated anew. So the very, shifting from those ideas of tribes to the formulation of modern nation states. But for someone like Ernest Manqoba, of course, it becomes particularly interesting to have this insertion, this traveling of the quota reliquary figure into this kind, or rather traveling across time and into this kind of reincarnation of modern art. Now, something that's interesting about the quota reliquary figure is that, of course, it also speaks to the passing on of knowledge from one generation to another. It's something that would be placed on a basket in respect of family members and ancestors. But again, I think it's particularly interesting because as much as we can talk about the disconnect in South Africa with those particular collections, it's interesting that many of the South African artists, Ernest Manqoba, but even Gerard Sekoto, would have worked with a sort of broader notion of what African art actually meant, but developing it as modern art. Now, again, one can go on for much longer about this particular vignette, but I'll stop here for the interest of time and move to the next one. Third vignette. We are almost there. Okay, so this was Simphiwe Danance. It says, the lyrics say, "We will leave the township." And I started to think about what kind of geography this might be, especially when we start to think about, of course, the museum. In South Africa, we can't avoid it. Because whenever you start to talk about access, it's about, whenever we start to talk about communities, it's about black townships specifically. And the reason for that I've already stated. And of course the song says, we will leave the township. But, one starts to actually realize that museums themselves also have their internal townships. And so how do we transcend those internal townships, those black townships, the ghettos within museums? This particular vignette is not necessarily about the museum or the collection at all, but I want to kind of think about broader. So if these objects are to travel, if these museums are to open, what are the kinds of terrains we might be encountering? What are the kinds of public spheres we might be encountering? One of the projects that I'm currently working on at the moment is based on an area called Everton. Now, Everton is particularly interesting because it wasn't actually established by the apartheid government in the 1950s following the Group Areas Act. It's a miracle, in fact, because in most of the plots in Everton were purchased by black landowners in 1902. This is something we were talking about yesterday. Now, if you can imagine, in the 1800s, this would have been the time when the Dutch descendants, who today, of course, we refer to as Afrikaners, would have traveled northwards into the country and would have settled in this area. So in the 1800s, this area belonged to Afrikaner owners. But given the Anglo-Boer War, those Afrikaner owners, and I think at the end of the Anglo-Boer War, towards the end of the Anglo-Boer War in 1902, those owners, of course, then sold it to 2 British colonels. But again, because at the end of the war, there were not many resources, Britain also did not want to spend money sending resources following the war. So those 2 British colonels then decided to sell it to black landowners. But at the time, of course, it was very difficult for black people to own land. You couldn't own land in your own name. You had to buy it in trust, which means that you even if you bought it yourself, you would have to have it signed off by a white person. But in that year, 1904, well, in those years, 1904, 1905, one case was won, which showed that actually there is no legislative basis upon which they can say black people can't own land. So luckily, at that point, black people bought large tracts of land and could become independent in that particular area. Now, by 1905, the African American missionaries, the AME Church, bought land in Everton in South Africa, and of course established institutions like Wilberforce College, which was of course named after Wilberforce here in the United States. So you have, of course, these very interesting transatlantic journeys that we actually don't expect might have also created the kinds of geographies into which we imagine the movement of these objects will take place. Now, of course, by 1913, South Africa passed the Land Act, which meant that most of the arable land, in fact 90% of the arable land, would be given to white owners, and the black majority would be contained within 10% of that land. And so over time, of course, Everton became very great, cosmopolitan space with black and white landowners, kind of non-racial space, if one can call it that. But only by the 1950s, the apartheid government started moving white people to different parts of Everton, but eventually outside of Everton. But also forcibly removed other people where the white areas where areas were declared white into Everton. So today, Everton, of course, represents that kind of history, but also the hidden layers into the kinds of terrains that we're talking about. There is not a single museum in Everton, and the recent project that we did was about talking about what kinds of representation of heritage should we be exploring within spaces like Black townships, but also particularly spaces that may be seen as Black townships, because Black townships that were formulated in the 1950s were very small little places, really just to house the labor that would then service white South Africa. Whereas Everton, of course, differs significantly from this. And of course, in the latter years, Everton becomes really just sort of the center of the politics, the bus boycotts, the rent boycotts. But again, I think also that happens because by the 60s and 70s, it became a sore point. So they began systematically dispossessing people of their land by raising rent, but also creating things like permits that people had to pay for. And then forcing them into a kind of municipalization, which meant that either they sacrifice part of that land or they don't get any sort of municipal services. But I mean, again, although this particular vignette has nothing to do with actual objects, not that it doesn't have anything to do with actual objects, but it allows us to begin to think about how problematic these spaces are. And again, what are the broader unseen museums and heritages of apartheid and colonialism? So the place or places themselves become artifice and artifacts. And so the study of museums and decolonization of museums and our curatorial practice can't but engage in the kind of spatial sacrifices that are facing us. So these scenarios are kinds of hypotheses, and again, as I said, very exploratory on my part. But they reflect multiple journeys within countries like South Africa, within the African continent, but also beyond it. Itinerancy and the historical and habitual restlessness of objects and people may enable us to carve untrodden pathways in the framing of institutions and the publics that they inhabit. So taking curatorial itinerancy as a practice of mobility, fluidity, and the restless quest for social engagement and justice, these reflections traverse across time to speculate on what it may mean to humanize classical African art collections. So what do we mean when we begin to particularize in terms, when we talk about communities, when we particularize, what are the terrains that we're actually talking about? And, does that actually, we would, and in many ways, we would need to begin to undo those geographies first. So while many African art collections signify dispossession, displacement, and capture, there is continued movement. Their transatlantic journeys, their dissociation from everyday life, and the pursuit of their reintegration beyond institutional and national boundaries to precarious and often uneven publics. And again, I mean, this is a kind of contrast to the kind of immobile and slow to transform institutions, which would require for us to develop modes of generating and disseminating knowledge through nomadic approaches, and in contrast to the permanence and hubris that is displayed in the domineering architecture of imperial and colonial institutions. And in this way, we begin to think about knowledge as much more fluid, social, and relational. And to think about it as a kind of epistemic justice that needs to be pursued, which would involve the recognition of multiple sites in which knowledge is generated and exchanged. It would necessitate moving between boundaries and reclaiming the collective right to space. And in some ways, it's reminiscent of the Zulu saying that "Ukamba ukubona," to move, to travel is to see. But it also means that to learn, one must make a journey. And it feels as if we've suspended these journeys in terms of the collections. And movement is transformative since it potentiates new encounters. And so, if we began to think of our own curatorial practices or ourselves as curatorial practitioners, and think of ourselves as pedagogical nomads, in this way we begin to transgress multiple forms of social boundaries, and even from even in terms of class, not just race and gender. This would mean that curatorial practice also becomes more responsive to the changing conditions within which senses of community could be created, which are also responding to the geopolitics of colonialism and subsequent national independence. Therefore, even the way that we think about the geographical scale of community, which could specify sometimes local community of practice, but could also be extended to refer to, for example, the diaspora, national and global political communities of transatlantic Pan-Africanist kind of understanding. And also the acknowledgement that the communities that are constantly being created and exchanges and transforming and changing communities. So again, I mean, I think one of the ideas that I lean on when I talk about the importance of itinerancy in our curatorial practices, I lean on an idea by Emeka Okereke. He calls it kinopolitics, which is the social politics of movement. The word kinetic and politics, but it's the social politics of movement within countries and across their borders, which of course he defines as I am where I think. And in this way, one can begin to think about a sense of transness as an essential part of our practice. Not just transness in terms of transformation, but also the transit. And as I said, many of these objects are like in-transit objects, but also a kind of temporariness that we have to accept, being transitory as well. So thank you. I mean, this I think brings me to the end of my talk, but again, when one thinks about being in the Umbombela, one wants to not necessarily be in the train that was constructed to move labor, but one wants to be in the gathering that allows us to understand transitory or transness or trans communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nomusa. It was really emotional hearing all that South African music. Thank you so much for bringing that to us. So our next and final speaker, Juliana Belevacqua, is an assistant professor and Queen's National Scholar in the Art and Visual Culture of Africa and the Africa Diaspora at Queen's University. She's worked as a researcher and curator at the Museu Afro-Brazil in Sao Paulo for 10 years. And she's done extensive curatorial and research work in different museums in Brazil to explore and share African art and Afro-Brazilian collections. She's also published extensively and has a new book out. So let us welcome Juliana.
Hello, everyone. I hope you are not so tired. I would like to congratulate Agnes for this great initiative, and also I would like to thank Anita for inviting me. In 2011, the São Paulo-based Afro-Brazil Museum organized an international conference on museums and African art, which gathered curators and scholars from Brazil, the United States, Mali, and Senegal. During a visit to the museum exhibition rooms, it was possible to notice part of the American participants embarrassed when they came across the African art collection. Only recently, I understood that discomfort probably has different reasons, but the main one seems to be related to the fact that most of the works in that museum were not canonical. The way the works were displayed contributed to this perception. Instead of exploring the particularities of its own collection, the museum visibly tried to reproduce similar display strategies used in museums from the North, which were emphasized by the use of labels with general information that could easily approach works from different collections. More than 10 years after that episode, I would like to bring some thoughts on how non-canonical collections, but with deep meanings for their communities, could contribute to the discussion on decolonizing African art in museum collections. The history of African art collections in Brazil, like in most museums, is initially connected to European modern art. The art dealer Ladislas Sede, owner of the Sede Gallery, opened in New York in 1950, was an important figure in the initial formation of some of those collections. Sede was married to a Brazilian woman from a rich family and had wide access to collectors and institutions like the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology of the University of São Paulo. Sede gave lectures on primitive art at the Museum of Modern Art of Rio de Janeiro in the mid-1950s, reinforcing the connections between African art and European modern art. It's not by chance that Pietro Maria Bardi, one of the creators of the Museum of Art of São Paulo, MASP, for example, exchanged letters with Sede in 1958 to buy an African art collection for the museum, a deal that did not happen for unknown reasons. As director of a museum well known for its European modern art collection, Bardi was clearly interested in the relationship between modern European artists and African masks and sculptures. The relationship between African art and European modern art in Brazil, however, did not last long. In the 1960s, researchers of the African culture in Brazil, most of them initiated in Candomblé, an Afro-Brazilian religion with Yoruba origin based on the cult of Orishas, started to become actively involved in the creation of the African study centers in Brazil and African art collections in museums, contributing to a major change in the profile of those collections. Rather than focus on connections with European art, African artworks were acquired in order to reinforce the African ancestry of the Brazilian people through Candomblé. It's not a coincidence that the majority of African art collections in Brazil are formed by works from the Benin Bay region, notably from the Yoruba peoples, and directly or indirectly linked to the Candomblé religion. This change was quickly noticed by the dealer Ladislas Sede, who began to offer to his Brazilian clients works exclusively made by Yoruba peoples, while in New York he continued exploring African works from different parts of the continent and as primitive art. My research on Ladislas Sede's work in Brazil, that was possible thanks to a University of São Paulo grant in 2017, showed that Sede was aware about the specific interest in Yoruba sculptures. He bought books about Yoruba art and traveled to Salvador, Bahia, in the city in the northeast Brazil, famous for its Candomblé house and Afro-Brazilian culture. Pierre Verger, a French photographer who moved to Brazil in 1946, was probably the most prominent figure in the process of building collections linked to Candomblé. After traveling to Benin as a photographer, Verger realized that Brazil, especially the city of Salvador, and countries like Benin and Nigeria, had many cultural and religious similarities. His experience on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean was the start point for his PhD research on the ebb and flow of slaves between Benin Bay and Bahia, still a seminal work in Afro-Brazilian studies. Besides his work as a photographer, Verger was involved in the creation of the Center for African Studies at the Federal University of Bahia in 1959 and in the creation of the Afro-Brazilian Museum in Salvador in 1974. He also played a decisive role in the formation of African art collections at the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology of the University of São Paulo, and indirectly in the collection of the Afro-Brazil Museum in São Paulo, since its founder and curator, Emanuel Araújo, is a Candomblé member and was a close friend of Verger. The notion of collecting based on African ancestry, reinforcing the historical ties and connections with specific African regions, influenced how Brazilian museums changed the notion of authenticity. The fact that the works originated from Africa was enough to consider them authentic. The example of Afro-Brazilian Museum at the Federal University of Bahia is quite significant to understand the particularities of the African art collections in Brazil. When Pierre Verger traveled to Benin in the middle of the 1970s to acquire works for that recent founded museum, he did not prioritize works used in ceremonies and rituals. Instead, he commissioned works from local sculptors. His acquisitions in Nigeria mixed sculptures made by local sculptors and those purchased in the markets of Oyo, Ibadan, and Ede. Although those works had not been previously used in ceremonies and rituals, the authors of the objects were extensively documented by Verger, something rare in museums' African collections everywhere. During his many research travels between Africa and Brazil, Verger also worked as a mediator, taking and bringing objects to be used in ceremonies in some Candomblé house in Bahia, something that actually has been happening since the 19th century through other key Candomblé figures and dealers. Despite of being bought in markets or commissioned from sculptors, those objects gain new functions and meanings while being used and collected by Candomblé house and priests. Some of those works eventually found their way into museum collections. The relationship between the Brazilian audience and African art is also aligned with an idea of ancestry through Candomblé religion and can be exemplified by the image of an installation at Afro-Brazil Museum in São Paulo, composed of a set of fochés, one of the most symbols of the Orisha, Xangô. The display is clearly a reinterpretation of an installation dedicated to Xangô at the famous Candomblé house Casa Branca in the city of Salvador. As soon as the installation was opened in São Paulo, the audience began to offer gifts and coins, a practice that still happens inside Candomblé house and on the streets. Here we can see some, I hope you can see some gifts and coins. This example reveals that the symbolic meanings carried by these objects remain even after they have been taken to museums, going far beyond an aesthetic fruition. The recent inclusion of works from other African regions in some museum collections still follow the same criteria, excluding, for example, the traditional notion of authenticity. The reason for that cannot be explained exclusively by the lack of funding, an issue faced by most Brazilian institutions, or by the fragility of the African art field in that country. The few canonical African art collections in Brazil have never been privileged in exhibitions or publications. Part of the African art collection of the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro, for instance, was formed through an agreement with the Ethnological Museum of Berlin in the 1920s. However, it was not fully studied by Brazilian scholars, curators, an audience before its destruction in the 2018 fire. In 1988, the Museum of Art of São Paulo, MASP, organized the exhibition África Negra, Black Africa, to celebrate the centennial of the abolition of the slavery in Brazil. The show, curated by Pierre Verger and the Italian architect based in Brazil, Lina Bobardi, gathered 40 canonical African artworks from the Musée de l'Homme in France. Verger and Bardi did not hesitate to include in that same exhibition 50 Yoruba sculptures from Brazilian private collectors, some of them Candomblé members. Both curators did not create any hierarchies between the works from French and Brazilian collections. Curiously, the exhibition design was a clear reference to Xiré, a circle where Candomblé members dance possessed by orishas, despite the inclusion of works from African societies unrelated to the orishas' religion. The exhibition Arte Negra and the installation at Afro-Brazil Museum seem to be an exception in the Brazilian context. Apparently, museums in Brazil have difficulty in recognizing the specificities of their African art collections. At the same time that acquisition criteria are not the same as those of museums from North America and Europe. Sorry, I have a picture of Xiré. The ways of displaying them and addressing them in the labels still use those institutions as their main reference. Despite the particular stories and unique life cycles behind many African works in Brazilian collections, they are usually displayed without highlighting their rich particularities, what led us to understand the reaction of part of the group that visited the Afro-Brazil Museum in 2011. What would happen if that same group had the chance to see the Xangô installation and the audience reaction? What would happen if the participants knew the history of that African art collection? I don't think the reaction would be the same. The history of African art in Brazil may help us rethink and problematize categories that we regard as universal. Maybe this is the right time to include collections from the Global South in the discussion about museum decolonization and the legacy of colonial practices. It's an important opportunity to re-examine the stories being told about African art collections. It's time to bring out of the museum storage those objects that might challenge the canon and that are present or hidden in almost every European or North American museum as well. What stories might be behind those objects until today overlooked by most curators and scholars everywhere? Thank you.